Ascending Mount Purgatory, Canto 13. Topics: a weapon against every foe, happiness and human connection, avoiding occasions of sin, comparisons are odious. In the spiritual life, there are really no one-size-fits-all solutions. Each person is unique and every sin requires its own treatment. One sin we should run away from, while another we should fight vigorously. Rational analysis might work for some temptations, for example, but not for others. If we allow ourselves to rehash our grievances and hurts while we are still upset, we are more likely to feed the flames of anger than extinguish them. We need to wait until we are reasonably calm and then analyze. Thinking about our temptations to impurity almost always lands us right back into the dangerous territory we were trying to escape from. Knowing how to make progress in the spiritual life means becoming familiar with the various weapons of the battle and knowing when to use them. In line 1, we notice the stairs. They are not what you would expect when climbing a mountain. Even though Mount Purgatory is steep and the passages are often narrow and intimidating, they are designed for climbing. Dante and Virgil are not inching their way up dangerous rock crevices and fissures as they were at the start of their journey. They are walking up stairs that have been built to ease their path up to the summit. God is conspiring with us, not against us. The hardest part is the beginning. Mount Purgatory is less concerned with punishing sin than with undoing its damage and unraveling the knots that sin has left in our souls, kind of dis-eviling us. It is a place for spiritual rehab. And Dante immediately notices that things are quite different on this terrace. The lessons he learned on the terrace of the proud do not all apply here. Here, for example, there are no carvings to teach the souls the lessons, first about virtue, then about vices, that they need to learn. The walls and pavements here are bare. We do not yet know the reason these souls are treated so differently. Dante hints at it by his symbolism and allows us to discover the truth in our own time. The shift, however, makes us suspect some sort of surprise. A different kind of spiritual cleansing seems to be at work here. The rock of the terrace is livid, the color of a nasty bruise. The significance of the bruising is something Dante will return to in his imagery. For those who have read Inferno, the livid color is also reminiscent of the description of the stone from which the trenches in the pit of hell are constructed. The livid stone there was portraying an image of a hardness of heart that the fraudulent display to their fellow man and the isolation which it produces. The parallel imagery suggests that we can expect that the souls who are passing through this terrace are somehow being cleansed from a similar hardness of heart toward their neighbors. Again, Virgil draws attention to the deserted areas of purgatory. He is afraid that if they delay here at the entrance to the terrace to ask someone directions, they might waste too much time. Who knows how long they would have to wait before someone appeared in a place so empty as this? The mountain is enormous and able to accommodate innumerable souls, but sadly, it is sparsely populated. In this terrace, there is a continual reference to light, and much of the imagery is visual in nature. This is because the sin that is purged here, envy, is a sin grounded in seeing. Seeing the good things others have saddens us, or seeing the evil they experience, which gladdens us. The Latin and Italian name for sin, invidia, implies looking against someone or something, prying into their business. It is a sin of eyeing what others have. In line 22, Dante and Virgil are making quick progress on this terrace because our wills were eager, they say. Dante is both energized and somehow lighter because of his purgation from pride and the burdens it brought with it. Is his relatively quick progress also a sign that Dante does not need to spend time here, because he is far less troubled by envy than he is with pride? Dante will suggest something later, like this in the Canto. We tend to imagine virtue as something interior and private, and there is something true about that perception, but it is a habit in our soul that only we can develop, and no one else can do it for us. But in another sense, virtue is never something entirely private on its purpose. Human perfection does not consist solely in self-discipline or self-control, although these can be beneficial in the spiritual life. Virtue, whether natural or supernatural, has as its goal uniting us with God and our neighbor. Human happiness does not happen without human connection, and true connection cannot happen without virtue as its foundation. Here, back to the story in line 25, seemingly disembodied voices replace the instructional carvings as we saw in the Terrace of the Proud. Even though the medium of communication has changed from the visible to the audible, the same order of presentation is used. Examples of the desired virtue are presented soon after one enters the terrace, and Our Lady again holds first place among these lessons. Her words to our Lord at the marriage feast at Cana break the silence Dante and Virgil have been experiencing. They hear, "They have no wine." She is the prime example of noticing what others need and responding generously, displaying for us the virtue of fraternal charity, truly desiring and delighting in the good for our neighbor. To become holy, it is not sufficient to make ourselves lowly. We must be willing, even desirous, of placing the good of neighbor ahead of our own good. We need to use our vision to see the needs and our energy to satisfy those needs, even those of our enemies. It is only after walking more than a mile and hearing these lessons that Dante discovers which sin is being repaired on this terrace: envy. Dante, however, still does not know how the souls are being purged of this vice because he has yet to meet one of these souls. The images merely suggest the punishment that soon we see all too clearly. Not only is the rock livid, the souls wear cloaks of the same livid color as the rock. Here the emphasis is on the personal deformity and twisting that comes from envy. Envy makes us black and blue. Envy colors the whole world of the envious. The bitterness we experience at seeing our neighbor receive gifts or rewards that we desire for ourselves can destroy our awareness of our own blessings, removing the joy we would have received from them and rendering them cold and lifeless. Is there a special significance to the fact that the envious seem camouflaged, blending into their surroundings? Is possibly everything featureless so that what belongs to one person is indistinguishable from what everyone else has? The cloaks seem part of the purification this terrace is performing. They are training the souls not to compare the good they have with the good others possess. This stone is remarkably similar to the stone that formed the final pit of hell, where complex fraud was punished, fraud that was a betrayal of human and family connections. These profoundly human connections ought to have moved our hearts to help our neighbor, but our hearts were hardened and unmovable by the needs of others. As the prophet Ezekiel prayed, "Take from me this heart of stone and put in me a heart of flesh." This lack of human correctness, this heart of stone, if you will, underlies both the sin of betrayal and the sin of envy. The souls wear horsehair, coarse material often used for penitential hair shirts that were worn underneath one's usual clothing to irritate the skin and provide a constant mortification for the wearer. Perhaps we see hair shirts here as a remedy to the envy that clothing often inspires. There is nothing elegant about horsehair, and nothing to be envied. One of St. Philip Neri's spiritual directees asked him for permission to wear a hair shirt because he wanted to do something dramatic for God. And Philip, sensing that the man would benefit more from another sort of penance, gave him permission to wear it, provided that he wore it outside of his clothing. And people made fun of him for wearing the hair shirt the wrong way, giving him the nickname Brother Hair Shirt. St. Philip was convinced that the man received more spiritual benefit from the humbling comments of those who saw him than he would have received from irritated skin. Here, hair shirts are visibly worn by everyone. The envious, who seemed unable to desire good for others in this world and did not feel a proper connection with their fellow man, end up providing support for one another in purgatory. They learn, by means of their mutual dependence, a lesson that life did not teach them adequately while alive, that they are in fact their brother's keeper. Because why? Because we are all in this together. Here, Dante's images prepare us for finally meeting the envious souls in person. They are described as being as the poor blind men or the visioned orphaned, who never enjoy the sunlight. The full significance of this imagery is about to be revealed. We would all like our temptations to disappear on their own, wouldn't we? This would eliminate any need for messy battles and embarrassing failures. But progress in the spiritual life happens not because temptations cease to arise in our lives, but because we learn to avoid them more and more effectively, almost automatically after a while. We become experts at managing temptations. But attaining this level of spiritual confidence requires training, careful training. We need to instill firm and habitual reactions, a sort of new autopilot. This requires a neutral rewiring of our brains through repeated actions, which scientists call neuroplasticity. It takes perseverance and effort, but it does work over time. Our reactions are reformable, and we can become truly different. Back to line 70, the eyes of the envious are pierced and sewn shut with iron wire. The emphasis that Dante gives, however, is not on the gruesomeness of the punishment, but on its formative value. The souls are being trained like hawks, not to be distracted by others' goods. This is not a vindictive punishment, but a form of training. Because when a falconer trains a new hawk or falcon, the bird's eyes would be sewn shut with silk thread, not wire, or they were hooded. The reason for this temporary blinding of the animal was to force it to depend entirely upon his handler for food. He would come to recognize his voice and respond to it with trust. The bird would also learn not to be distracted by what was going on around or startled by the movements of his master. The blinding is part of the process of training and calming the animal so it can work with its handler peacefully and without distraction, like a horse wearing blinders. The purpose is to train him to be tame and rest unruffled. Something similar is happening with the envious souls. They're learning not to be caught up with what others have, and not to be distracted or disturbed by what is not their business. When the sewn closed eyes have been trained properly, they will be able to look at others with peace, confidently trusting their handler, God, to give them precisely what they need. The sewing shut of the eyes is also a reminder of a very important spiritual tactic, avoiding occasions of sin. When a temptation is more than we can manage, it makes no sense to stay to fight a battle we know we will lose. The only workable strategy is to avoid the occasion of sin, which is a strategic retreat and regrouping. In the case of a visual temptation to sin, that means exercising some sort of custody of the eyes and choosing to turn away, not looking at what will lead you towards sin. The envious are practicing an extreme sort of that custody of the eyes here. And Dante feels uncomfortable observing these souls when they cannot see him. This sensitivity that Dante has with respect to their feelings is a lovely example of the sort of compassion this terrace is trying to develop. Virgil shows that he is attuned to Dante's needs too. He responds to Dante's unspoken request without waiting for Dante to have to put it into words. And he says, he didn't have to wait for me to ask. Sometimes the greatest consideration we can show for someone in need of help is not making him humiliate himself by asking for it. In line 80, the edge of the road on the level of the envious has no guardrail or protection for the blind souls making their way around this terrace. Because who might fall? It seems unlikely that one of the holy souls would fall back to the terrace of the proud, because souls here cannot sin, and the only souls who can enter this terrace are those who have already been thoroughly purged of pride already. But for living souls, the connection between pride and envy is all too obvious. Because of our inflated ideas about ourselves, we can conclude that we deserve what others have. Pride and envy are mutually supportive sins, the one encouraging and leading to the other. The first words Dante speaks to these souls being purged of envy are ones of compassion. Rather than focusing upon their sufferings, he begins by addressing them as people who can rest assured to see the light of heaven someday. This circle seems pervaded by considerateness and a refined sense of delicacy towards the feelings of others. This stands in stark contrast to the hard-heartedness the envious displayed while on earth. The holy souls do not identify with any earthly city, but a heavenly one. In line 94, we see from Philippians 3:20, "But our commonwealth is in heaven." They are now clearly citizens of heaven, who once lived a pilgrim in that land. Even earthly citizenship is a possession they can now treat with complete detachment. The patriotic Florentine and Dante must find this sort of detachment hard to imagine, But for someone experiencing exile, as he is, this is a lesson he will benefit from learning. There is something fundamentally beastly and uncivilized about envy, like lions fighting over a kill. The lion's instincts drive them to desire food, even if it does not belong to them. Stealing some smaller and weaker predator's prey is far easier than stalking their own, but society cannot allow such primitive urges. We thrive as a society when the whole thrives, and giving up our individual claims for the sake of our place in community is a defining mark of civilized man. Leaving aside envy is, therefore, learning to be tame, like the hawk that has learned to trust and depend upon his handler. In line 107 here, Sapia describes her purgation as mending the frayed of my wicked life. Somehow the stitches that close her eyes also repair a life that was coming apart at the seams. The life of the envious, taken up with so many grievances and unfulfilled desires, is unfocused and scattered. But that is now being remedied. We are reminded again that repairing, not punishing, is the focus of purgatory. It is said that comparisons are odious. This saying, in its English form, dates from at least the 15th century and expresses a much-needed corrective for our very human tendency to measure ourselves against others. But what precisely about the act of comparison makes it odious? Well, we believe that God creates each human being to be a unique reflection of his goodness. No one is replaceable by someone else. And because each one of us is unique, God treats us in different ways. God gives to each what will benefit that person most. We do not complain when someone standing in line with us at the pharmacy is given a different prescription from the one that we get, because their illness is different and requires a different sort of medication. Comparing ourselves to others denies our own uniqueness. Comparing ourselves to others is always a spiritual mistake, a lack of trust in God's very individualized care for us. In line 110, we hear Sapia say that another's harm made me far happier than my own good fortune. Note that Sapia's offense and the offense of all the envious isn't only against the neighbor, but against God, whom we offend by failing to recognize and be grateful for the many gifts he's given to us, to each individual soul. The vice of pride tries to convince us to think that we must do it all ourselves and places an unbearable but self-imposed burden upon us. Envy is different. It in fact fails to recognize that God gives to each individual precisely what that individual needs. Since the needs of one aren't the same as those of another, neither will the gifts given by God to different souls be the same. So part of Sapia's rehabilitation is her coming to recognize that she owes much of her spiritual progress to someone whom the world would think of as poor and perhaps a little crazy. It's a lay Franciscan named Pete the Comb Man. To think that her salvation would depend on someone selling combs on the street corner and little more than a beggar is kind of crazy. And yet, Sapia owes him a great debt of gratitude. Despite her own cold and stony heart that rejoiced at the suffering of others, Pete's heart was compassionate and generous, and from him she felt the pitying warmth of charity. Dante doesn't think that envy is a major problem for him. He will return here, but not for long. He will be stuck for a much longer time in the first terrace for his pride. Dante, in the first canto of Inferno, was troubled by the she-wolf, if you remember, and that embodies avarice. But desiring to possess material things is a different disorder from not wanting others to have them. Our attitude towards others is not the defining characteristic of avarice. It does define envy. Finally, in 139, when Sapia learns that Dante has been led to Mount Purgatory and up to the terrace of the envious without dying, and that he will return to life on earth, she quite naturally asks how he managed that. You might expect that people would compare their state with his and ask why he's being treated so differently. It might seem for an occasion of envy, but it is not. Dante naturally interprets her interest in his state as a request for prayers. But it is more than that. Sapia is delighted at his amazing story because it displays God's love for Dante and the blessings he has bestowed upon him to make his salvation possible. Dante's joys are her joys. She is delighting in Dante's good. The purgation of envy is clearly bearing fruit in Sepia.